Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of the symposium, Building Tourism Resilience, Benchmarking Approaches from Japan and Australia. Thank you for all your attendance this morning, and for those who have joined us this afternoon, welcome as well. We move into the second part of today's symposium, where we now look at Australia. This morning, we looked at Japan and learned from Dr. Fung from Hiroshima University, Dr. Keir from Hokkaido University, and Dr. Ito from Chukyo University about rural tourism and the many factors that persist where they work. This afternoon, we'll go to Australia. So I'm very pleased to welcome 3 researchers from Australia. The first one this afternoon, in a couple of minutes, will be Professor Keir Reeves from Federation University, who will talk about the transnational conversation regarding Australian regional tourism. And then we will have Dr. Anne Hardy from the University of Tasmania, and then Dr. Michael Volgger from Curtin University. So welcome back, and I will hand over to Professor Keir Reeves, who will present our first paper this afternoon. Over to you, Keir.
Thank you for the warm welcome, Joseph, and also the generosity of our hosts. Can I also please personally acknowledge the Wakayama Centre for Tourism Research and also the Centre for Japanology Studies, as both tourism and culture go hand in hand from my point of view. The university, through the Institute of Global Initiatives, has invested in tourism research and has recently secured a 150 to 200 global ranking we heard about earlier on in tourism studies in the Times Higher Education. This is a superb result that builds on the strategic decisions and investments made over a number of years. Events like today drive international collaboration, esteem, as well as regional. We heard about earlier on, local and regional is important, national, transnational, and sometimes even international conversations. Some of these are theoretical and academic, and others are research to practice with applied outcomes. I feel that this workshop really speaks to both of these approaches. Can I also thank Kazui-san? She's been tireless in making this event possible. Joseph Sensei, he is a research machine with excellent ideas. Somebody I go back a long time with now. His research speaks to a commitment to a number of really important areas. He always speaks to values. He brings in a dose of realism with it. Amazing guy to watch as a researcher unfold. And for those of you online today, if you want to see a good way to set up a career trajectory, have a look at what Joseph's done in the last 5 to 10 years. Can I also thank Maki-san for her work on logistics and the wonderful welcome and the IT and just about everything, really. Can I thank the Australia-Japan Foundation for investing in this transnational dialogue? I'm glad they put money into it. And we're actually here in person, a number of us. Resilience and tourism are 2 key issues confronting both of our countries on the western edge of the Pacific Ocean. On this paper today, I'm going to talk about draws on 3 discrete regions by way of providing a context. Uluru-Kata-Tjuta, the World Heritage Area, and Yulara, the resort sits adjacent to it in the Northern Territory of Australia. I think we call that remote, and I'm presaging Michael's paper. There's also the Goldfields region of Central Victoria, where I live and work. And then there's also, I'd like to talk briefly about the Australian Alps and the northwestern Upper Murray region, which is currently experiencing profound flooding. And I think they all, in their own way, help us to examine the current capacity for resilience through tourism. It is 3 decades since John Murray published his widely influential book, The Tourist Gaze, that considered the environmental, economic, community and cultural implications of tourism. This increase in tourism led to more encounters and highlighted the need for tourism operators and policy makers to consider their response to local host communities. I'd like to briefly talk about this in terms of the 3 case studies, and also look at the question of regionality, which sometimes, but as Carolyn pointed out, not always, intersects with questions of history or cultural heritage. But they are living communities. They're not ones that are lost in some sort of speck of time. And the broad contextual question that I'd like you to consider is, where does regional tourism play into the resilience piece? The emergence of cultural tourism as a social phenomenon as an object of academic study can be traced back to the surge in post-World War II travel and the advent of massive leisure, something in Australia was known as holiday business. As incomes and consumption continued to rise, so too did the opportunity for holidays, for international travel, and the consumption of culture. By the 1980s, the flow of international tourists to major sites, say the pyramids, for instance, led to the distinctive branding of cultural tourism as an emerging niche market. WTO was called then, produced its first definition of the phenomenon, and in the early 1990s, the estimate size of this new market was said to be 37%, or almost over a third of all international tourism. So international tourism continued to grow throughout this region, driven by the heritage boom. What's interesting is that this is a contested term, cultural heritage, but as much as it doesn't always associate itself with the regions or rurality in the Australian context, it so often does. It was seen as a way that could stimulate economic activity in these regions. Some of them were struggling with a decline in population drift or a change in economic circumstances. And the growth in regional tourism was marked by the fragmentation into a number of different areas: heritage, arts, gastronomic tourism, film tourism, and creative tourism. These things, they really they interact. They're not clear in any sense. So, take you to our first slide. This is part of Uluru. I've got in shot. It's situated in the south of the Northern Territory, literally in the middle of Australia. Its formal name is Uluru Ayers Rock. It's a World Heritage Area, and it's traditional custodians of the Ainu people who have been associated with it for tens of thousands of years. It's Uluru and Katajuda is known as one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. It's profound, and it's inscribed on the World Heritage List for its natural and cultural values. I'm part of a team at the moment with a number of colleagues from Australian and Wakayama University, looking at the way that we can involve the local community, the traditional owners who are based in Mutijulu, to benefit more from the cultural tourism, or indeed all tourism offerings at Uluru Katajuda. So our work there brings us together with the historical narratives of written documents of community, with oral traditions, ecological and anthropological narratives of cultural landscapes, Indigenous knowledges and nuances with generational experiences of country, tourism, and visitor perspectives. And we're using Uluru Katajuda and Yulara, the resort, as a place to apply a specific critical tourism lens that broadly documents and examines the narrative of Indigenous people's interactions with Western models of tourism. Importantly, and I think this is crucial given some of the papers we've earlier on about the Japanese experience, local members of the community from Mutijulu have been involved in co-design and identifying potential tourism offerings, and they also contribute in detail to the research and cultural protocols that are central to having any successful project. And we analysed the existing relationships between Anu, the community at Mutijulu, stakeholders and other partners, and we're very interested in Anu self-determination. The partners I'm speaking about include the Voyages Ayers Rock Resort, which is a major resort of one of the premier tourism destinations in the Southern Hemisphere, Tourism Northern Territory, the key government organisation, the Land Council, as well as Parks Australia. And we're moving beyond what we consider to be conceptual desktop studies that critique tourism in Uluru, and what we do instead is draw upon a long engagement of country, deep cultural permission from traditional owners, as well as sustained support from all stakeholders. And we were invited to be here, and we're very honoured to be part of this project. And beyond the case study, we're really interested in the wider ramifications and implications for how Indigenous cultural heritage and the associated natural world, are interpreted, managed, conserved, and promoted for the economic development, often, but not always, through tourism and tourism property. And this is This is Catajuta. This is about 25 minutes drive, about 40 kilometres from Uluru. It's also a place rich in profound natural beauty, deep time consideration, as well as it's loaded with significant cultural meaning. Catajuta means that the heads or many heads. You might be able to make that out in the slide. So for this project, when we're looking at regionality, we're talking about connecting with community, and we're looking at connecting through community through new ways of engagement, through co-design, and we're exploring the idea of Indigenous voices and expanding on it, tourism from below, and we're applying it to what is seen as an exemplar of large-scale Indigenous tourism, and it's a long-running one as well. It's been going for decades, since the 1980s. However, we suggest that when aligned with more recent social, political and economic contextual discussions, it is important that the site is got right. It's an icon, but if it doesn't happen the right way, it could turn into a bit of a disaster. And we suggest that involves having economic and sovereignty issues resolved for cultural traditional owners. The question still remains, though, why, despite the many increases of tourism prospects, what are the benefits for the local community? Closing the gap is the way forward, and it has to be done in a respectful way. Perhaps the statement from the heart provides one such approach. It also speaks to not only huge opportunities and exciting times, but there are also some questions that still need to be resolved. How can tourism be structured to advance traditional owners in shared management futures, in actuality, not intellectually? There are also considerable policy implications. I'd suggest not just for Australia, but within the broader global tourism research community or within Indigenous justice dialogues. Okay, this is a place it's basically a ghost town now called Lawrence. What you're looking at is an engine house, the ruin, with a mullock heap in the background from the deep lead mining era of the late 19th century. The gold rush went from 1851 in Victoria and continued throughout the second half of the 19th century and formed the backbone of a lot of the wealth creation within southeastern Australia, provided a huge amount of money for the global economy, arguably staved off a world depression, and picked up where the Californian rushes ended in 1849. Okay, so what's interesting, I think, from a tourism point of view, is that there's currently a push to have a World Heritage listing for the Central Victorian goldfields. This will be premised upon the remnant heritage values, but deeply aligned with this is the visitor economy, cultural tourism, and the goldfields happens to almost overlay perfectly with the Victorian spa country, which is to do with leisure, visitation, weekenders, and it's really an overlap that, depending on what happens with the bid, sees the emphasis being on culture, regional identity, and tourism economy. Some places like near where I live, in a place called Dalesford, has less than 4,000 people on a Tuesday night. Every weekend, it experiences over 30,000 visitors, and much of the town is geared around it, and it's one of those key regional destinations. Okay. Not just about beautiful things static in the landscape. Communities also tried to leverage off their regional identity or the cultural heritage through having events. This is Clune's Book Town, which for those of you who haven't been there is a bit like Hay on Wye. It's a weekend a year. It has a large increase in people, sometimes up to 15,000 people. It creates jobs for the local economy, brings a lot of people into the life of the town, or there's a decision-making process of the regional economy that wouldn't necessarily always be there. And I think what this means is these places that are off the beaten track, if you like, that are sometimes seen as not that desirable, all of a sudden enjoy a moment of prominence, and they also enjoy a level of activity which in turn drives a whole lot of other agendas that were spoken about earlier today. The desire to move to the country, to the desire to move to a regional setting, to have to make a lifestyle choice to people who have common ground, maybe just want to go there with your book club, all sorts of things. However, COVID's impact on this tourism has been far-reaching and global in scale. Alan Lew and others assert that the COVID-19 pandemic event has caused significant, although not a total collapse of the human Earth system. They argue that it is a four-stage cycle, drawing on their resilience, adaptive cycle theory, where nobody expects the status quo to remain in a post-COVID-19 world. And that's the case, I think, for all of our presentations today. The challenge for tourism destinations like the Victorian goldfields in this context is to grasp the opportunity and to rectify an otherwise deflected global system, while noting that tourism remains subject to larger overarching agendas. In this regard, the biggest response and baseline shift is how the region projects itself. While tourism visitation and money, I think, remains imperative for many throughout the region, there's also a place that considers itself to be a cultural heritage destination, a keeping place of community memories, a cultural asset central to the social and economic well-being of Central Victoria. It sees itself as a driver of regional identity. So there may also be a silver lining for the goldfields in a post-19 world. In many countries, mobilities have been constrained, and there's a sense that cultural heritage has benefited from borders being closed, or perhaps tourism sites as well. They've been overfished as over tourism, and people are increasingly turning to their own communities. Travel is undertaken close to where people live, and increasingly they look for their own locales for touristic engagement. This is a more restrained, calm, less intrusive thing. The re-evaluation of cultural heritage and the rise of the proximity of the route traveller close to where you live is an appealing one for many. This potentially inadvertent benefit is tempered by practical realism in terms of how viable it is to be maintained and what sort of government supports are required. And I mention this because where I live, there's needed to be economic supports for the gastronomy industry, for restaurants and foods through government voucher systems that had to be spent locally. We heard about that earlier in the Japanese context. Likewise with accommodation as well. And I think these to a certain extent have saved a number of businesses. They're usually small to medium operations, restaurants, family-owned hotels, 5 or 6 room setups in places like Dalesford, Airbnbs, these sort of things. They've really they felt a lot of pressure, and the government's had to prop it up. So just moving right along. So let's talk now about the third part of this by way of providing a bit of a snapshot, excuse the pun. This is the role of the wine industry and in the Upper Murray River region. For those of you in Australia, I'm talking about Rutherglen, and for those who are overseas, I'm talking about an area along the Murray River, which is the border between Victoria and New South Wales, up towards the Australian Alps. And the role of the wine industry, and let's talk about it for a second and considering the bigger context of regional development, post-COVID recovery, and for many of them responding to the dramatic floods that they're experiencing at the moment. And just to give an example, at one point along the Upper Murray River recently, the floodplain was 23.5 kilometres wide. This is the sort of country we're talking about. Yeah, so in 1839, grapes came to Rutherglen, which a bit later, sorry, was settled by Europeans on Bungarang land, and then the grapes then were used to service the gold seekers who came to Australia looking to win their fortune. What happens is that a number of very famous chateaus, Campbell's, All Saints, which we'll look in a minute, a number of places that some of you may know, very big, modeled on the European experience. And by 1878, All Saints Estate was awarded Australia's first international gold medal at the Paris exhibition, but then wine production was soon in a glut. Volume just exceeded demand, and duties and whatever else sort of put the brakes a bit on the Victorian wine industry. But what did emerge from it is a very strong tradition of winemaking, of chateaus, of international markets, And then eventually tourism came, and it's been seen as one of the playgrounds of Australia since. So this is a site down the line of the Silver Ghost of the All Saints Winery. Sorry about this, the sad slide. But this sort of encapsulates what happens today. High yield visitation. There's probably 40 or 50 family or some privately majorly owned corporation wineries making high-end wine, having major experiences. This is all underwater at the moment, by the way. And they're playing off their heritage from the wine era. They're playing off the legacy of the gold rushes. The previous slide was from Mount Ophir, Mount Gold. It was established because of the gold rush, even though the real gold was within 6 inches of the soil, the grapevines, as they say. And what this meant is that these sort of places, they leverage off their past, but they also are very much grounded in the visitor economy of today. And they've been decimated by fires, smoke taint, by very, very full-on flooding in recent times, the COVID pandemic, and then for some areas along the Murray, drought. Okay, I'll just let's move it along. This final slide I've got of the northeast is a place called Beechworth, which I think encapsulates a lot of what's happening in this part of the world. It has a visitor economy. It's very touristic. It's seen as a lifestyle destination for people who are either heavily superannuated or decided to make a jump to a regional setting. House prices are very expensive. They're comparable to metropolitan Melbourne. It's seen as a desirable thing. And for the first time, perhaps in 60 or 70 years in Australia, the move has been towards the country rather than the urban drift that defines so much of the Australian experience. And you might hear a bit more from Anne about that as well. The other thing is that about Beechworth, it's a very pretty, if you like, Victorian era architecture. It's got a sort of quaint side to it. It's a signature look, and it also enjoys not only a certain vernacular goldfields architecture, but it enjoys a whole lot of eateries, restaurants. That what for those who were in the earlier sessions, Suzanne was talking about certain people come and they want certain sort of clothing shops, they want certain food, they want delicatessens, and this is all there. So you can be literally in splendid isolation, enjoying everything, buying fashion, driving a Tesla, whatever you want. Yeah. Which is, very appealing. It's just clearly not for everybody, or it's not within the purview of everybody. Okay. So many of these tourism destinations throughout Southeast Australia, there was a rich intersection of history, heritage and tourism. And I would add, this is a point that Professor Fong talked about, these are living communities. They're not museums, where they're not static places where people don't live and work. There are still industries in some of them. You work very hard in the winemaking industry. It's not romantic, it's hard physical work. And there's a number of people that work here. So as much as they might be couched in their heritage, I don't want to present them with some sort of pastiche, because they're not. They're still going, and they hold significant numbers of people who live there and make their life there. But nonetheless, they do leverage off their past, and tourism is a big part of it. Much of these people, these offerings provide entertaining cultural experiences. So I could suggest the best way to understand Victoria's cultural assets, and I think it's natural that tourism assets have different, though sometimes complementary drivers, is to acknowledge the significance of history and cultural heritage in the present day. Not to crowd out the ideas of rurality and regional living, but just to see that where they might have a comparative advantage in terms of how they present themselves. And I don't know what it's like in Japan, but I suspect it might be similar. But to go to the country in Australia is to have some sort of dignified retreat, to live a more wholesome life, to speak to a set of values that belongs to another era, where life is more simple and you go away for the weekend and have a break. It's healthier. It's a simpler, more dignified way to live, if you like. And that's certainly apparent in what drives a lot of visitation. Whether it's true or not, that's certainly it's not nostalgia, it's just a perception of what it's like to spend a weekend or a week away in the regions for many metropolitan people who have very busy lives. Yeah. Yeah, so then I guess what's become apparent from this though is that tourism throughout this part of the world is a portal through which most people, the visitors, encounter the past. They don't read books about the past. They don't do bushwalking. This is what they know. I think this combination of interpreting, providing experiences, public and business tourism policies, and community concerns, as I alluded to also with Katajuda, are all interrelated and cannot be treated as silos. This makes it a very complicated piece. Living communities, minority communities who have been here forever, who have stakeholders and be part of co-design, the need for cultural respect, not just to First Nations people in Australia, which is a very important thing, but also across different parts of the community. They are central to coming up with a sustainable, resilient model of tourism in a post-COVID, post-fire, post-drought, post-flood environment. So I'd suggest that sustainable resilience tourism is crucial. It's a big part of a settlement, but it's not simply about commercial models designed to increase visitation to institutions or places. Instead, it's about how cultural heritage or other things that will draw people there can be expressions of community values and patterns of living. Examples of this, more indicative rather than exhaustive, include something like Booktown in Clunes in Central Victoria. This event brings community representatives into the process of commercial activity, as well as providing forums for cultural and community expression. When presented in this manner, tourism is inclusive, excuse me, that is good for, it's inclusive, and that's a concept that's good for visitors and community members who are engaged with their communities are building social capital. And there's also the question of benefiting from sustainable tourism and development, which often attracts government funding or seed money to do things, and in some cases, better heritage preservation, like beach work. Importantly, all of these initiatives are profitable. You know, they can't just sit there as wonderful things. They just, people won't do them, unfortunately. And that probably is more in the world of heritage. You know, you don't need to make profit out of heritage. It is what it is. But in tourism, yeah, there obviously is a bottom line. And I think if these experiences throughout, say, Australia, that I'm talking about, aren't grounded in their communities, especially regional and rural ones, then they potentially exist as an elitist niche, bereft of visitors and potentially a commercial market. Okay, so the issue is to encourage regional economic development and recovery following the impacts on rural Australia of drought, bushfires, coronavirus, and most recently, flood. Now, this recognises that tourism is one of the key strengths of Australian rural and regional destinations, and that tourism is going to be central to these recovery programs. It already is. Beyond 2020 steering committees report to the federal government, the Australian federal government, refers to the important role of regional Australia in diversifying Australia's tourism products and the economic and social benefits that may flow from this. Regional tourism is particularly often a source of competitive advantage in parts of rural Australia, providing a distinctive regional identity and increasing the appeal of regional destinations. I think Uluru Katajuda is a case in point, and I'm sure what we're about to hear from Michael Fitzroy River will be similar. So I just want to finish this talk by speaking a bit more abstractly about the way that tourism sites may be understood as sites of memory. For what I know, this might be some might think this is a nostalgia thing, but I don't intend to do that. But I do think what Pierre Nora was talking about when he was talking about sites of memory, lieu de mémoire, is that they exist because there are no longer any other milieu de mémoire, places in which memory is a real part of everyday experience. These sites of memory, in the proper sense of the word, are crucial because they represent crossroads. They are points where space and time meet memory. These are the places people seek out. Perhaps that's where they go to Uluru, to see the rock, to make some connection, you know, whether it's a spiritual one or an emotional one, or it's a question of even thinking about one's citizenship or to understand First Nations people better. It has become a lieu de mémoire for many who travel there. Regional sites contain many of these places throughout Australia where people make a pilgrimage, Uluru, or they go to the Goldfield Spa Country to understand the colonial past and enjoy leisure, or to the northeast to the wine country for the weekend away to walk. Sometimes that might be combined with nature-based tourism, cycle tourism. These things are also very big. And I just say during this visit, we've been to an onsen. We'll visit Kamanakoro. We'll also consider the legacies of industrialisation. Yesterday, we went to the long-established fishing village of Carter, and we'll also consider visit three World Heritage sites, two of which are regional. Most then of what we're going to look at occur in rural and regional Japan. And I hope that this talk of these three sites that I've spoken about, I'd like to draw more conversation out about the comparisons, not similarities, comparisons and differences, or where those intersections might provide new meaning. I think that this talk speaks to similarities and differences that bring more meaning to what we're talking about today. And I hope that this helps to address common problems such as rural population drift in some areas, or indeed to promote regional cultural heritage tourism opportunities between our two countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Keir Reeves. I think Keir raised some really interesting points there about the importance of heritage and historical geographies, which is often under-acknowledged when it comes to speaking of rural tourism, and the issue of the key question, what are the benefits for the local community, is a question that resonates. So, thank you, Keir. Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Dr. Anne Hardy from the University of Tasmania. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you, Joseph. Thanks, everybody. Okay, it's great. It's totally great. All right. Well, thanks very much for having me along to speak. I want to firstly thank the Australia-Japan Foundation for bringing us all together, and of course to thank Kazu-san, Maki-san, Joseph Sensei, everyone in the room. It's been really lovely to meet you, and we're only 48 hours in, and we're already in love with Japan, I think it's fair to say. So what I'm going to talk to you today is a little bit about some thoughts that I had on how we might understand regional and rural tourism. And I guess I'd put a provocative sort of second part, time for a rethink. And essentially what my talk is going to do is end up sort of thinking about methods that we might want to use to really understand how regional and rural tourism is occurring, and from different perspectives. So that's sort of where we're going to end up. But first, I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. I'm from Tasmania, which is an island right down the bottom of Australia. It's an island which is about 64,000 square kilometres. There's only 500,000 people living in Tasmania, and 60% of it is wilderness and natural areas where nobody lives. But of course, they're the traditional land. It's the traditional land of the Palawa Pakana people from the Chihuahua of Tasmania. So it's got a lot of different parts to it, Tasmania. There's natural areas. This is myself with a group of students in Cradle Mountain. Beautiful wildlife, but it also has rich cultural heritage, both historic and current, and has become really well known in the last few years for a sort of a place where you can go and experience culture as well as nature. And we have the Tasmanian devil as well, and perhaps, but probably not, the Tasmanian tiger, because it's now extinct. Just a little bit about myself. I was very excited to be invited to this because I've never actually talked about rural tourism, but I actually grew up in rural tourism. So this is a photo in the top left in the 1980s of my family when they bought a farm that they developed. It was just paddocks. You can see it from the air down the bottom. And when it was first bought, you see the Ford Cortina from the 1970s up in the top left that was carrying the baby strawberry plants around. And my father was a farmer, built it up to, you can see all the paddocks down the bottom. It had a coffee shop and a restaurant, and was one of the places in Tasmania that attracted the first Singaporean and Hong Kong tourists. And eventually, about 10 years ago, my dad, who's down the bottom there, sold the farm to Mr. Tao, who's from China. Dad offered it to us, but having seen the pain of tourism, all the kids said yes to the cocktails at the succession party but no to the business. So sadly, the business left the family, but it was also a happy story because we watched our parents build this beautiful business up, and we all realised that we really didn't want to be in tourism. We just wanted to study tourism instead from the outside. So yeah, a bit about my background. After that, I thought, yes, I don't want to be a tourism business owner. I want to look at it and experience it. So I did my PhD in Queensland, and for the last 7 years, I guess, I've been doing research looking into how tourists move through destinations by using technology, and also looking at the impact that tourism has on tourism communities. So that's just a real quick look into who I am and why I do this stuff, and that's the book that Joseph talked about. And I think it's always really nice to reflect on your background and how it impacts upon the research that you do. So in Tasmania, we have terms rural tourism and regional tourism, and we use them quite differently. So the whole island of Tasmania is regarded by the Australian government as regional because there are so few people that live in Tasmania. It's so underpopulated. Like many of the rural places that you've described, we have a population that is slowly declining, aging, and we also have a population where 49% of people are actually functionally illiterate. So that means they can read and write basic English, but they are not very literate. It's the worst literacy levels in Australia. And that's, along with my background growing up in tourism, those two things have had a massive impact on the way in which I do my research. So in Tasmania, rural tourism is really defined, and it's often called agri-tourism. And that's where tourism occurs either on a farm or perhaps on a place which actually sells produce. So it might be a cellar door selling wine, it might sell honey, it might be cheese, it may be fruit in the case of my family's farm. And we also have other sort of commonly recognised forms of tourism in Tassie, such as nature-based tourism, cultural tourism, and heritage tourism. So in the last few years in Tasmania, agri-tourism or rural tourism has become the darling child of the Tasmanian government. They have put many, many millions of dollars into the industry because it was regarded as a resilient industry through COVID, because when tourism shut down in our island, then this other form, the businesses could often turn away from tourists and actually just sell their product. And so a really good example of that is Coringa Farm, that is owned by a very good family friend of ours called Tim Parsons. And Tim and my dad used to go to Hong Kong and Singapore and sell their tourism product over there together. And Tim has a farm that is a family farm that's been in the family for 150 years. And he ran very, very successful tours to the Hong Kong and Singaporean and China markets, where he would take them on a tour around the farm. Billy, his sheepdog, would round up the sheep. He would shear a sheep. And it was a really successful business, and it had accommodation on it. So when our borders locked down in Tasmania, it was a very tough lockdown. We were locked away from the rest of the country. And so Tim actually turned back to the farm, and the sheep and the poppies up in the top right-hand corner kept his farm going. And this was the case for many rural tourism businesses in Tasmania. And consequently, the government has decided that, you know, their economic success was an indicator of resilience. Therefore, they're putting a lot of money into this particular industry. I guess the thing is that, and this is sort of moving away, but staying on the island theme, I guess, is that Tasmania is an island. So Tasmania is, you know, separated from the rest of Australia, And for many years, we've suffered the island imaginary sort of complex. And that is where we've been seen as sort of slightly inbred, perhaps, you know, because there's not many of us living on this little island. There are many jokes about Tasmanians being inbred, and I love the jokes. So if you have any, you can share them with me, and I'll tell you if I haven't already heard it. But we're also regarded, often islanders, I think it's sort of, you know, really vulnerable people, you know, subject to destruction and hazards, reliant on government help from interstate and overseas. And this lovely quote, or the idea from Delowry, that islanders are often thought of as passive recipients who are stranded in the middle of oceans waiting to be saved by outsiders who can aid their progression. But I guess what happened in Tasmania during COVID is that the island, we were cut off from the rest of Australia, and there were many government initiatives that were put into the state to try and keep the island going. And in fact, what it did was it gave these islanders, Tasmanians, a greater sense of who they actually are. And far from being, you know, vulnerable people, it actually was a time of reckoning for many islanders, I think, where they were really able to understand what it meant to be Tasmanian. Suddenly we had to buy Tasmanian products. It was really hard to even get things flowing into the island, and we had a lot of supply chain issues. And so in a way, I think that island imaginary was really challenged during COVID. At the time, there was actually a conference held by Regina Scavens at the International Geographical Union, and a group of us came together and ran a session together. And we've actually just about to publish this book called Islands and Resilience, and it really looks at those issues in detail across many different cultures. And I guess the outcome of this book is really sort of arguing that it's not just about economic, you know, resilience is not just about economic issues, which is what it was kind of regarded as by the Tasmanian government. That resilience is about, you know, revival of identity, perhaps enhanced pride, resurgence of community spirit, sometimes, not always, practicing traditional knowledge, and possibly even learning new skills. In the case of Tasmania, the government actually funded the tourism industry to do a degree, so they allowed them to enrol for free in the university in a course. So within a month, we went from 30 students to 330 students, and we spent the entire, you know, worst part of the pandemic actually working with the tourism industry and teaching them online. And it was a really very interesting experience for us as educators, and hopefully for the industry as well. So this is an example of a scheme that was run during the pandemic called Buy Tasmania Today, Prosper Together Tomorrow, where people were encouraged to buy Tasmanian products to get through the pandemic. As I mentioned before, this is just from the newspaper. When Tasmania was cut off, we've got a moat and we're not afraid to use it. That was a quote from the Premier of Tasmania when he cut the island off. And what we also saw was that we started to see a bit of resistance actually coming towards the tourism industry. So this picture down the bottom here, on the back of a car, which we call a ute, a very Australian car, it says, "Tourism kills, keep borders shut." So suddenly a small voice started to emerge during this time, and it's become a little bit louder over time. So we've seen different forms of resilience arise, not just in terms of resistance, but also recognition during the time that marginalised people's access to resources and their agency can really sort of determine what we think of as resilience. We also saw during this time when the island was cut off that both external and internal forces actually impacted resilience. So not just help from the larger government, but also the forces from within the state. And well-being was also a big issue during that time. So I guess the the point here is sort of saying that resilience, we really, I guess, many people are now arguing we need to study it not just from the perspective and economic perspective from those who actually live within particular places. And that's really where the research that I do sort of comes into it. Firstly, from the perspective of tourists, and then from the perspective of communities. So we'll have a look at that now. I guess the thing is that when we're looking at resilience, we can look at it sort of in economic terms, and then again in terms of how the community sees tourism. And this little case study is of a project that I started a long time before COVID in 2016. And this was an app that we developed to try and track people as they move through destinations to get an understanding of where they went. Because unless we know where people are actually going, we don't understand the impacts that they're having on communities. We can't understand how much they're spending. We don't really know how they move between the communities and that type of thing. So Tourism Tracer was an app. It was based upon, you could put it on your phone. It used GPS technology, so it tracked people to within a metre of where they were going. We asked tourists, we got their consent to put the app on their phone and to see if we could track them as they moved through Tasmania. So we met them at the airport and we recruited around about 1,000 tourists just prior to COVID in the state of Tasmania as they moved around. It had a survey in it, so we understood who these people were, and we could combine the GPS data with the survey data as well. So it was an exciting time, and it resulted in a data set that was probably one of the first data sets that tracked tourists around our destinations for their entire duration of their stay. So what we got was data like this. It really showed us exactly where people were travelling, and we could see them going around the state doing the lap of Tassie, and we could also see them, going on tours like on this boat tour on the west coast of Tasmania. And then we also had a dashboard. So we could actually watch on this dashboard as people moved around Tasmania, and you had a filter down one side, so you could compare people by where they entered the state. You could compare them by their age, their gender, why they came to Tasmania. I know time's on us and I want to keep on, so I won't show the video. I'm just going to flip forward to this one. We could see itineraries, so we could understand how they were moving around. We could compare it with what was being promoted by Tourism Tasmania. We could see their directionality, and we could see what they did on each day, and the different colours represent, day one, which is yellow, through to the pink colours, which is around about day 8. For these particular people. So we got some really interesting data. We could see how people were dispersing, and the fact that if you flew into Hobart Airport, which is down here, much less these tourists don't disperse, whereas tourists who fly into other airports were really the ones who were driving dispersal into these regional areas. And this is a little example of what we did with the data. This is a paper that we put out maybe two years ago or 18 months ago that was on wine tourists. And what we did was we looked at this form of agritourism, and we wanted to know how people moved between wineries and whether, what was driving this behaviour. So we did the study in the Tamar Valley that Keir probably knows pretty well. And what we did was we got all the tourists that we had recruited. We had about 500 people from a particular time period. And we got the data and we looked at the tourists who drove less than 15 kilometres an hour in around a cellar door. So with this GPS data, you can actually sort of make a circle around each of the vineyards, and then you can look at the tourists as they drive into that circle. If you see that they're slowing down to a certain speed, then you can, or even stopping, then we kept them because we assumed that these were people who were going into the cellar door. So of that 500, we saw 86 wine tourists stop at cellar doors in the Tamar Valley. We could then understand how long people were stopping for. So the average stop was only 27 minutes, which surprised me. Of the 86 wine tourists, they made 157 stops and they visited 22 cellar doors. And what we could then look at was, if they go to one cellar door, do they go to the next one down the road, or how do they pair it up? And we found that when cellar doors are close to each other, people don't necessarily go to cellar doors which are close. Sometimes they do, but other times they would it looked like they had a fascination with champagne, or maybe they had a fascination with red wine, and we'd see them just going to the red wine. So we could understand, what type of people went to different types of cellar doors and how they matched their experiences together. We could also see what were the drivers of people staying for a longer period of time. So people who stayed for a long time in cellar doors, they tended to stay at cellar doors that had lots of different product and experiences. And we could also identify segments of tourists based upon how long they were in the region, how many cellar doors they actually visited, and also how they moved around the region. So we got some very rich data into how tourists behaved. And I think that's sort of really important when we're trying to understand resilience, particularly post-pandemic. The more recent project that I'm working on is different, uses the same technology, but is it completely different, takes a different perspective. And this is a project that I'm working on with Joseph and also with Tamara Young, with Regina Scavens, and also with Api Mavono. And this is a project where we're looking at the concept of citizen social science. So with this particular project, this is the paper that we've just got out, which lays out this new research agenda that we're proposing. And the whole idea is that we make an argument that if we want to really understand how tourism is going, if we really want to understand resilience, if we want to understand what's going on in communities, we need to talk to people in the communities. But we make the case in this paper that we perhaps need to reconsider the things that we've been doing for a long time as researchers. So back to the 49% of people in Tasmania who are illiterate, that was kind of at the back of my mind, and at the back of Joseph's mind was probably his previous research in, humanizing research and amplifying the voices of the unheard, and that the same thing was the case for the other researchers. We were really interested in those who are often not included in research because perhaps they're from marginalized groups, they can't speak English, or maybe they can't even read English. And that's sort of what was behind what we did. With citizen social science is what we're arguing is that rather than us going out as researchers and taking our pen and paper and doing our survey and us designing questions and asking community members, what we do is we argue that perhaps we should get the community members to design the research for us. Perhaps they can tell us what's the most culturally appropriate way to actually collect the data. Perhaps they can, so that means they're co-creating methods, they're leading and also being involved in the data collection, and perhaps even helping us analyse and understand the data that we use. So this particular project, what we're proposing to do is using the Tracer technology, using an app, but designing an app that is very, very low in words so that many people can do it regardless of their literacy levels. And then the app could actually track people, but then it could also be designed by the community to collect the data that they want. So it may collect photographic data, it may collect voice data, it may collect textual data. And the idea is that the community members in this particular situation, they could actually collect data for us and tell us what they like and don't like about tourism when they like it, when they don't like it, because we know we have seasonal fluctuations, and many of us like tourism when the numbers are low, but we don't like it when the numbers are high, when we live in a tourism dependent community. So this is sort of the type of thing that we want to get towards, is, you know, getting these hotspot heat maps of understanding, you know, where things are, and it's a thought that perhaps we can sort of head towards with this particular project. And so I guess it offers us the potential to contribute to rural tourism futures. It humanises research. The observed become the observers. So rather than going in and looking at communities, we work with them and they help us. It amplifies voices of the unheard. It helps us to understand the visitor experience and also community perceptions of tourism futures. So I guess to sum up what this talk has done, this is just my favourite place in Tasmania. It's called Lovers Falls, and you can only get there by kayaking on this beautiful river. It's a very peaceful place. So I think that what I've tried to do in this presentation today is kind of look at different lenses through which we can understand resilience. So it might be the lens of the traveller and how they behave, or it may be the lens of the community member and what they actually want for their tourism futures. So maybe some ideas for thinking ahead in the future and how we approach our research agendas. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne. That was the second of our three papers this afternoon. I understand some people online are having some sound issues. I hope they've been resolved. We are trying to fix them where they appear, so please bear with us. Thank you, Anne. Anne raised a lot of questions around methodology and how we go about talking about rural tourism and collecting data to make decisions about rural tourism. Anne is known internationally as Miss Tourism Tracer, and this these pioneering methodologies will be particularly important for us that work in rural areas. So with that said, I pass you on to Michael Volgger from Curtin University.
Thank you very much, Joseph. I wanted to start, as Anne did, by thanking everyone here, in particular Japanese colleagues. It has been already a fascinating few days. So particular thanks, of course, to Professor Joseph Keir and the whole team, Kazue Nakamoto, Maki Kobayashi. Thank you so much for everything you have been doing for us and for organizing this beautiful symposium. I also wanted to start by acknowledging the Australia Japan Foundation, which is part of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Australian government, which enables us to do this, to do what we're doing here. And last but not least, a big thank you to the Wakayama University, in particular CTR, the Center of Tourism Research. I'm going to talk about a case study here. Professor Keir Reeves has already provided us with a glimpse on the sort of situation I'm going to talk about. So I'm trying to give you a perspective on indigenous tourism development in what probably people in Japan would call a very remote area. It's called the Fitzroy Valley in Western Australia. And I hope by looking at this perhaps extreme case of a rural tourism situation and scenario in a very remote place, we can also draw some learnings or at least comparisons. I think also to contextualize this situation a bit, it is important to remember that Australia is one of the most urbanized countries in the world. It's a large place, it's a large country, it's a continent, but at the same time, it's very, very urbanized, which allows very stark contrasts to appear between urban places and regional or remote areas, which are vast ultimately. I also would like to acknowledge my co-authors. It's been a big team working on this project, comparatively speaking, and not only the co-authors on the actually that you can see on the slide, but also some cultural advisors we had on the project, Steve Kinane, Karen Damon. They also translated, they advised, because we work in a very remote indigenous community, but also the indigenous interviewees themselves for sharing their the insights and knowledge. It's also been a sort of, I mean, and Hardy would not define it probably as citizen social science, but I like to think it's not that far away from it. So this is again, I'm trying to contextualize what I'm going to talk about so that you can picture it for yourself a little bit. The Fitzroy Valley, which I'm going to talk about, is this orange dot on the slide, which is nestled within this larger orange dot, which is, or this larger orange area, which is called the Kimberley region. And I also put these bluish half transparent circles over Western Australia, because I tried to illustrate what might be called urban, regional, and remote in this place. So there's only really one urban area, which is probably 100 kilometers in diameter. It's the capital city, Perth. Then maybe 500 kilometers in each direction, we have a landscape, which, or a cultural and natural landscape, which might be called regional, and I'm simplifying here. And probably more than 3/4 of Western Australia would be called remote. So it's really remote and sparsely populated. So I'm looking at one place in this very remote section of the state. The Kimberley region, which is this light orange place, is quite large. It's more than 400,000 kilometers, which makes it larger than some Australian states. So larger than, for example, Victoria, where Keir Reeves is from, but it's extremely sparsely populated. It has only a population of 36,000 inhabitants, which gives you an idea of what sort of setting we are talking about. It has 6 towns, and the towns are also very, very small, most of them. And in addition to these 6 towns, approximately 160 communities, mostly indigenous communities. These are really very small villages, I would say. Half of the population is also indigenous people in this place, and 90% of the land is actually claimed under something which is within Australia is called native title, which is a sort of customary ownership for indigenous people. Gives them sort of ownership, but not entire ownership, I would say. So the Kimberley region, of course, is has long been occupied by Aboriginal people, tens of thousands of years. In the 19th century, then the colonizers, British colonizers, arrived, and they initiated mainly a pastoral economy. So it was very much driven by agriculture, and also indigenous people first were forced to work on this in this pastoral industry, but then to some degree also embraced it as their own, and they nowadays also became often owners of these pastoral stations as well. From a tourism point of view, what this region sells is essentially remoteness. From a Western perspective, or even from an Asian perspective, I would say, we might say the landscape is empty. Okay, it's empty. But indigenous people would never agree. It is not, for them, it is not empty. It's full of culture and significance. But for us, it often looks empty. It has, of course, these wide landscapes, these ranges, waterfalls, rivers, and four-wheel drive tracks. So it's famous for this sort of tourism, remote tourism, outback tourism, but also cultural tourism as a key element of it. So in sum, it depends on functioning natural and cultural landscapes. Within that larger region, I'm looking at a section of it, which is called the Fitzroy Valley. It's at the heart of it is this river, which is the Martuwarra Fitzroy River, one of the largest free-flowing rivers in Northern Australia. I'm saying free-flowing because it's not been dammed as some other rivers. So it's still subject to the seasonalities, to the wet season. It becomes very, very large. It's the largest river in Western Australia, in particular in the wet season. It is very important to life in the area. Life essentially centers around it, and I mean, it's literally, so it's important for food, but it's also important from a spiritual and cultural point of view. And essentially everyone we interviewed, the Indigenous interviewees, they said their relationship to the river is one of very deep belonging and custodianship. And there are very strong concerns about this water governance there. And Indigenous people have self-organized and set up a Martuwarra River Fitzroy Council, which tries to negotiate with government and other stakeholders how this water is used. Culturally, it's also quite interesting because it's the center of the valley, which is called Fitzroy Crossing, is really it's the meeting point of 5 distinct and living language groups. They are called Buduma, Walmajari, Wankachunga, Nikina, and Gunyandi. And in a sense, the Fitzroy Valley is not only defined by the river, but also by these communities. And there are quite a few of them. They're tiny, but there are 45 of them in the valley, with this Fitzroy Crossing be the largest, and the largest have 300 inhabitants. So also the largest one is very, very small. In total, there are 4,500 people living in what is called this Fitzroy Valley. I think this quote, or at least the beginning of it, is very useful in understanding what the region is. It says the region as it defines itself today is the product of a layered history. It is a cattle station landscape imposed on underlying Aboriginal cultural and linguistic landscapes. The contemporary valley defines itself in terms of the country and the cattle stations that people were first forced off, and the communities to which they began to return, including more recently also on cattle stations, which they now own. So agriculture and cattle farming is a very important part of the identity of these of the people living there. And as I said, Fitzroy Crossing is where they come together. It's known as the place where the language groups meet. These are very different language groups in a sense. So the southern ones, they're coming from desert country, and there's large Australian deserts there southeast from this place, Great Sandy Desert and so on. And the northern groups, they come from this river country, which is more characterized by limestone ranges and so on. So from an economic point of view, as you could imagine, there are some challenges and issues in the region, in particular around employment. So on average, between 15 to 20% of the population are without a job. But this needs to be compared to a situation where cost of living is really high. It's higher than in urban areas, and quite higher than there. So this also means that tourism is attractive because tourism is a labor-intensive industry, and there is hope that tourism could provide these places for the workforce, so to speak. It's actually already the third biggest employer in the region after public services like education and healthcare, not agriculture. Although agriculture and pastoral, the pastoral landscape defines the region to some extent, it is not so important from an economic point of view as one might imagine, actually. So there are challenges in the region in general, but they are somewhat exacerbated or clearly exacerbated in the Indigenous population. And that's what Keir already referred to, this slogan of closing the gap in Australia, because there is a big gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous population in terms of their participation in the workforce. So it's 30% of indigenous people versus 80% of non-indigenous. Business ownership, for example, although 50% of the region's population are indigenous, only 6% of the businesses are owned by indigenous people, and so on and so forth. And also generalized indicators such as life expectancy. I think this is really sad. It's 10 years lower in the Aboriginal population than in the non-Aboriginal. Home ownership is 5 times lower, and high school finishing rates are 4 times lower than in the non-Aboriginal population. So, as I said, tourism there is a lot of hope in tourism, but it's already quite important comparatively speaking. We're talking about 80 million per year tourism income in the region, which translates into, I think, 8 billion yen. So it's not nothing. There are also quite a few tourism businesses in the region, but still, we think, and our interviewees also thought, that there's more potential there, given the cultural richness and natural richness of the place. It is also very important, I think, to know that in the ongoing discussions in these communities, how to economically develop the place. And different stakeholders participate in that. So it's the government, it's the locals, then it's this external, often external investors into agriculture, and there is mining operations as well. And there have been debates of what is the best scenario in going forward, and tourism is one of those scenarios being put forward. So what did this study look at? It essentially looked at what the indigenous people's perceptions and aspirations were around tourism development, in particular around benefits and challenges. Just a very, very quick look at the literature. So what does the existing literature tell us? And I looked here only at the literature in indigenous tourism, but it's very similar, I would say, in terms of challenges and benefits to other, rural tourism issues, but also community-based tourism and so on. So it's not unique, I would say, to indigenous tourism. Starting with the benefits, there is a clear recognition in the literature that tourism can potentially enhance the cultural capital. So it can help locals, indigenous people, to appreciate their culture themselves, but also raise awareness externally that there is a rich culture there. Of course, there is this fine line with commodification of culture that we all know. So when we transform culture into tourism product, this does something with it. It's not necessarily bad, right? The culture is something dynamic. It transforms it, but it can have unintended consequences, of course. And it is a fine line between maintaining lived cultural practices and not just doing things for the money's sake, and becoming money driven. I also add the opposite can also occur. I think that culture tends to get sort of frozen, or is an attempt to freeze it, because tourists want this authentic experience. So that can also happen. Of course, there are financial opportunities around employment, entrepreneurship, and so on. But some authors are skeptical, and they say, at least in Australia, the financial promises, the economic promises, have not always realized, have not materialized ultimately, and they were not able to compensate for the colonial past and the problems of the colonial past. I agree, but I would say the benchmark, using that benchmark is also quite stiff on tourism, probably, and quite harsh. And in general, in the literature, there is a strong recognition that the governance of this tourism development is essential. So, is it locally driven? Is the local ownership of it? Then benefits are much more likely to occur. Looking at challenges, and interestingly, quantitatively speaking, the literature on challenges is less prevalent than on the benefits of tourism development. It mentions, of course, the commodification aspect that I've already mentioned. It mentions this critical element of community involvement that I've already mentioned. It mentions training and education, generally speaking, but also business education more specifically. And also, and I think importantly, the issue of how to fund tourism development in such a remote place, right? How do we create quality tourism products, and how do we maintain them over time? One thing is launching a tourism product, but one thing is also earning enough money and saving the money in order to be able to reinvest into this product. And this can be a challenge in some of these community-based tourism endeavors, because the community has expectations also in terms of benefit sharing, right? So entrepreneurs need to balance community expectations. They need to, but they also need to balance and consider future reinvestment needs, and this often poses them for quite. It puts them in a difficult situation. And last but not least, and I really want to stress this point as in my conclusions, as you will see, that indigenous tourism development is often very much hampered by the broader social cultural context, the broader social cultural issues that arise. And while this is mentioned in the literature, I think it came very, very strongly through our work here in a quite challenging environment overall. So looking at our findings, we conducted 21 interviews in the area. All interviewees, they agreed that there is tourism potential in the area. Of course, everyone believes in their place. There's a cultural diversity, natural landscapes, the trumps there. In terms of benefits, they mentioned potential benefits. They mentioned, of course, employment, but not just employment, also employment that is potentially more conducive to the locals, employment that allows to marry cultural values, which in this part of the world often means being on country, as the locals would say. So being outside, being on their homelands, showing people around, tracking animals, tracking food, tracking water, telling stories. Indigenous culture is very much an oral culture, has been for a long, long time. So a lot of the interviewees said the beauty of tourism is that it plays to our strengths. So that this is, I think, is a very important aspect here. Then the cultural benefits, of course, of fostering reciprocal cultural understanding, and what in Australia is called reconciliation between the different groups. And then also helping to instill a sort of pride into Indigenous peoples after decades of negligence and challenges and issues. So, for example, this interviewee here said, we become self-determined, we become self-sufficient in our own occupation. There's so much positive things that get caught in this Indigenous tourism web. Reconciliation is one of them. Every year, I have got about 15,000 people participating in the tours. They have actually done reconciliation face-to-face and bridged the gap far more than they do sitting in an office. That's the bare bones of it. So the point of view is, we don't need to teach reconciliation at school, but just send them over and then take them on a tour, and then I show them what our point of view and our perspectives are. And the interviewees also stressed the potential ecological benefit of tourism, in a sense that tourism can help to bring people from the cities into these regions and showing the people why the locals are actually protective of the landscape, of the culture, of the natural landscape as well. So here this person said, we need to start showing people why we are so protective country. We have all these beautiful sites that all have their stories. Many are sacred and have cultural significance. Each story is unique to these places and each have their own name. Getting that story out will show why our people are so protective of our country, and this could be a benefit of tourism. So overall, the interviewees were hopeful if the tourists would come from the Australian cities. So 90+%, 95% of the Australian population lives very far away from this place. But if these people who are the decision makers would come and see it, then there is hope they would also understand why they are skeptical about irrigation-based crop agriculture or opening up to mining, although people understand the economic benefits of it. Looking at challenges, so again, as in the literature, there was mentioned the strong aspect of education and training, so very basic business education essentially as well. This lack of intergenerational wealth creation and access to funds, cultural shyness, maybe that's a problem sometimes in other parts of the world as well, lack of confidence in this remote region, and also priority of cultural obligations. Sometimes business interests and obligations clash with cultural obligations, and it's not always easy to make them fit. Of course, infrastructural challenges, and last but not least, and this is already the point I want to make. In this case, it is a symptom. So there have been quite a few episodes of youth crime, increased youth crime in this part of the world, and I would say it's a symptom of underlying issues in the community. As this interviewee here said, if you want to act in that space of promoting indigenous tourism in these remote areas, you need to address the socioeconomic determinants, which are around education, housing, and employment. And employment needs to be done in a cultural way that leads to sustainable change. Often, the non-indigenous community tells the indigenous community what they need, instead of sitting and listening and hearing what they want to do, and then enabling them to do that. I think there's so much truth in that sort of quote that, to me, this has been, I think, the key finding. So if we compare, maybe on a higher level, some of these findings we obtained with the literature, I think broadly, unsurprisingly, they are in line. Okay, so it's not that that these issues haven't been discovered in the literature. Let me nevertheless try to emphasize a different emphasis, perhaps. So in this case, there was a lot of hope in the economic aspects of tourism development. People have a lot of hope, and in other studies, often there is also this recognition that there's a risk that comes with tourism development. Commodification, sell-out of culture, and so on and so forth. It hasn't almost been mentioned in our case. The question is why. I think it's also because the communities are faced with bigger issues affecting their culture, so that the risks of tourism to their culture somewhat pales in comparison. And also this strong emphasis on the potential positive relationship between protecting natural landscape and tourism. Also there was a very strong, I would call it a hope there. But in general, very much aligned. And also, as has been mentioned in the literature before, tourism is not just seen as a hopeful way of doing business because of its financial benefits, because of the ecological benefits that are mentioned, or potential ecological benefits that are mentioned, but because people think the system of tourism potentially fits their cultural system better than some other economic development pathways. And that's been mentioned in the literature before. In terms of challenges, again, the findings are very much in line with the literature in terms of stressing the need for human capital development, education, training. But as I said before, this strong hope in tourism development came through, but this strong hope being hampered by bigger issues in the community and people not knowing how actually we can make the most out of the tourism opportunities, while our motivation, while our time are so much affected by things such as lack of education, lack of jobs, problem with housing, also problem with substances and crime, and so on and so forth. So I think to some degree, it is misleading to only make an economic discourse about this, and it's even more monodimensional. And I think here I'm a little bit with Keir Reeves to make it a tourism discussion. So the issue is broader. If we would like to encourage tourism development in very remote areas, often this doesn't start with tourism development, but it starts with other topics first. And yeah, sellout of culture through tourism seems to be almost it didn't surface really in this study, which surprised me to some extent. I conclude by mentioning some practical recommendations. This study has been done with a very strong practical intent, as I probably couldn't hide. It's been done for transparency, I say, for Environs Kimberley, which is probably the largest not-for-profit organization in the Kimberley region, and trying to protect the biodiversity in the region, and having found in Indigenous people strong allies for achieving their goals. And this work we did was very much targeted at the government. The Western Australian government has been delivered to them. So we mentioned we recommended a number of things. I mentioned just 5 of them. First was to looking at this interface between declaring or extending protected areas, be it national parks, be it UNESCO heritage sites, whatever, and tourism development. This was very much supported in the interviews, as long as there is strong Indigenous involvement and potentially leadership as well. Again, as mentioned in the literature extensively, the governance is crucial. So the local people need to be enabled to take leadership, which ensures commitment and confidence, but also makes sure that the type of development we try to instill actually fits the place and actually fits the culture as well. The most important point from my view, at least, addressing broader social issues, safety and security is of course very negative to, or if it's not given, it can be very negative to tourism development. But in my view, it's a symptom of underlying problems which need to be addressed. Expanding the number, quality, and connectedness of attraction points. So I think we often forget when we want to do tourism development, we need to think of attraction points. Culture is an attractor, so it is a potential for an attraction point, but it's not an attraction point in itself. So there needs to be some sort of product development, and the locals were very much aware of it. And it does also include accommodation. I think that's also an important point, because otherwise, and it happens in this place, people just drive through, they don't stay. And last but not least, the entrepreneurs that we interviewed, they very much said, look, it's well recognized that business mentoring is important. And business mentoring has been in this place for a long time and very successful. So a lot of businesses started. But they said what is missing is often ongoing mentoring through the different stages of maturity of a business. Challenges evolve, and there needs to be ongoing support through these challenges. And as I think it's also the case in Japan, trust is key. Once trust is established, you can build a lot out of it. It doesn't make sense to always restart from zero and bring new people in. But once it's established, let them follow the businesses on a journey. Yeah, I conclude on this note. As you have seen, it is a sort of a case study. I hope it is somewhat relatable to Japanese situations. I know it is an extreme case, but yeah, hopefully by highlighting such an extreme, remote situation of rural tourism development, we can also somewhat learn about the space of possibilities, the whole space of challenges that we face. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. What a thorough and long-running project. Congratulations on that. Michael raised some points that I remember I was at a online conference, and the term human capital and social capital was argued about quite a bit. People were saying, this is the problem. We are seeing humans and culture as capital. And when we see it as capital, we see it as something that must be developed and we make money from, right? Not to criticize you, Michael, but to just say that's a broader discussion, right? So At this point, we have some questions that have come through online and offline. We would like to have the three researchers who just presented their work join us at the front here, and we'll have answer some of these questions. I'm sure there are lots of questions because the contrast between Australia and Japan couldn't be starker in many ways, but also we see that there are some distinct differences. And as researchers, we ask ourselves often, how do we reconcile these differences, especially if we work across international boundaries? So our first speaker was Professor Keir Reeves, who spoke about a number of things, but most importantly talked about how rural tourism rests on a lot of historical and heritage things. This idea of development from below rather than development from above, and the important question of what are the benefits for the local community. He also talked about the wine industry, increasingly becoming a feature of some rural areas in Japan, especially up near Mount Fuji, and Japanese growing wine tourism industry. The resilience is not only related to ecological resilience, but social resilience as well, and how rural areas tend to be sites of memory. Very often this is the case. Anne talked about a number of things, but most importantly, one of the things that I got from Anne is the idea of methods regarding how we can do rural tourism research. Anne talked about the social drivers of resilience, and also this notion of dispersal, right? Often when we talk about the impact of tourism, we want to see greater dispersal. For example, in Australia, the majority of tourists travel up and down the East Coast and don't necessarily go to Western Australia or Tasmania. In Japan, the triangle between Kyoto, Osaka, and Tokyo tends to be the most visited triangle. So for rural tourism, the question of dispersal is increasingly, how do we get people to move beyond the honeypots or popular areas of a country, such as Australia and Japan, as was referred to earlier. Michael's presentation highlighted how in Australia we have urban, regional, and remote. And for those who are not familiar, there's a word that's not actually an English word, but when we refer to anything over there, we refer to it as wupu, because it's far away, beyond what we can imagine as somewhere.
The outback.
Outback, yes. And interestingly, what Michael talked about, how very often tourism is seen as a savior for social and economic ills, when really there are underlying structures that first need to be resolved before we can see the benefits of tourism. As Michael said, there are underlying social and economic pain points or structural constraints. Tourism might just make cosmetic changes, but because unless those structural changes underneath are fixed, like in Japan, demographic change, population, aging of population, tourism might just work around the edges, but not necessarily address the structural changes. And this idea that Michael framed of tourism as a vehicle for reconciliation or decolonization, in many ways makes me think about what the capacity is for research on Ainu tourism in Japan, right? Whether there are some similarities. So perhaps this group we might engage with that at some point. Yeah, because it's not something we hear about a lot in Japanese tourism research. Perhaps it's something that we can do. So with that very brief summary, we'll go to some of the questions and from the room and from colleagues who've sent them in online or yes. So for those of you who have persisted online, thank you for persisting with whatever technical difficulties we have. We hope you can hear us clearly now. So I go to the first question. This question appears to be for Michael and Keir. And it's from Monina Bukat at the University of the Philippines in Manila. Thank you, Monina, for your question. There are informal institutions on top of formal institutions in indigenous communities that are often ignored in tourism development. By informal, I mean the power and authority within the indigenous peoples group that is different from those under the political authority of government and authorities. The success of Indigenous tourism, I think, is to be able to understand how these informal institutions work. The question, are there informal institutions in the case of the Fitzroy Valley and Uluru, Keir? So Keir has a hand up, you can start, Keir.
Thanks for the wonderful question, Monina, and greetings from Japan. I think you've really hit the nail on the head with it, and questions of cultural authority can only come from community that have their own ways of doing things, cultural frameworks, sanctioned to do certain policies that don't necessarily correlate with the panoply of the state or government policies. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but ultimately to understand Indigenous organisational structures at Uluru and with other people involves necessarily recognising a very specific way of doing things in terms of governance and the deep importance of culture and identity and who's allowed to speak.
Questions of permission and authority. By the way, if you're looking at Keir on the camera, that is a moustache on his mask. Michael?
Yeah, of course, I do agree. I might add that in Western Australia, also the tourism, the Indigenous tourism governance is to quite a degree driven by an Indigenous tourism organization, which I think is a fascinating phenomenon to study, to observe. I would say that it's been a very positive overall phenomenon. It's called WATOC. It's called the Western Australian Indigenous Tour Operators Council, and it's been around for quite some time. And I think the main success factor behind this Indigenous Tour Operators Council, which only includes the Indigenous operators, is trust. Once again, trust, because the level of trust between this body and the Indigenous entrepreneurs is probably much higher than between the formal or informal Western institutions, if I may say so, in Western Australia. So I think that self-governance, it is an element of self-governance, and it has been very important. And the Indigenous communities, they're quite creative in creating what probably should be called formal Indigenous governance in a sense, and coming up with innovative bodies as well, which also are well recognized within the Western governance system. So I mentioned, for example, this River Council, which again is based on the cultural understanding of the importance of the landscape and the spiritual landscape, the cultural landscape, the natural landscape, which cannot be separated. But it's been wrapped into a formal organizational structure which Western state-based institutions cannot simply overlook.
Keir, you wanted to say?
I just wanted to add one other matter that I think is important to mention, which sort of complements what Marcus and others have said. But that is, in Australia, as you're probably aware, we are a post-colonial, or maybe we are a colonial society, but we've been predominantly European nation state until the last 50 years. So there's a political dimension to a lot of what happens in terms of navigating reconciliation, respect for First Nations people, and this runs into a lot of the discussions between formal governance structures of the state or federal jurisdictions and traditional community organisational structures. And I don't think you can look at that relationship without thinking about questions of land rights, Indigenous justice, reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and a pathway forward, a shared future, if you like, where it's mutually beneficial, but it involves respect, sincerity, and a pathway forward together.
Okay. Thank you, Keir. Okay. We have a question online. Okay, and one in the room. Perhaps we can go to the question in the room from Januszka Schmidt from Groningen University.
Hi, thank you so much for your interesting presentations. I have a question, thinking also about tourism to indigenous areas and nature protection, nature stewardship, as you have called it so nicely. If we think about the idea of personhood of nature, in the idea, for example, that something has so much cultural significance that it gets legal rights, because otherwise there is a bit of a difficulty in many legal systems on how we can protect them, nature areas, without making them immediately a protected area. How would this idea of personhood, you have touched on this at the beginning of your talk, with we see vast countryside while indigenous populations see more in it than we are used to. This idea of legal personhood, how would that change?
The idea of what?
Legal
Personhood?
personhood, agency of natural
Nature, yeah.
resources.
Yeah.
How could that change our understanding of indigenous tourism?
Did you get that? Legal personhood. You know, I think you allude to the way rivers are being given the rights of.
That's
Fantastic question.
yeah, it's a very challenging question, I think, but a very good one. So yeah, there has been Aboriginal indigenous Australian writing on the topic, and they have very much insisted that this is the way forward. That the way of in also respecting indigenous worldviews, properly respecting them, seems to mean to allow personhood to be inscribed into nature. So, for example, Anne Polina, I didn't have her on the slide, but she's very much involved. She's an academic, an indigenous academic, very much involved with the place I talked about. So she's been writing papers under the name of the river, and she publishes papers on the name of the river. And it might look very strange to us, but that's what her thinking is, because she says that's the way how we need to. That's when we start respecting nature and culture and the spiritual element of it, which is all interwoven, the way indigenous people do. So it is actually a transformation of our thinking. I haven't thought it through totally this, but I find it a fascinating development, and I think it's a development which comes about because some indigenous academics and some indigenous people, they push stronger non-Western views, and I think it's good.
Thank you, Michael. And I wonder, and we'll go to you in a minute here, for colleagues based in Japan, this idea of, whether Shintoism ordinarily makes nature have a particular status in Japan, as opposed to in Australia, where perhaps we don't have that, apart from in the way indigenous people perceive of nature, as a rhetorical question, or a question that somebody might want to respond to. But anyway, Keir, for a comment.
No, I just did think about that a bit. Fantastic question. Just following on once again from Michael. I think the whole idea of identity or sovereignty for a river or a forest or something like that is very consistent with a lot of indigenous beliefs in Australia. Joseph made the connection or allusion to Shintoism, and I can see that at a broader philosophical level. In practice, it's really interesting. Where I'm from, there's a place called Victoria. It's the southeastern state. It's probably the most progressive state at the moment in Australia in terms of, others might argue that, but it's seeking to have a, no, but I'm making a serious point here.
No.
And it's seeking to have some sort of land rights and recognition of First Nations people within the Victorian government constitution. And that might presage what's happening at a Commonwealth level. This has huge implications for how we understand Crown land, government land, who owns it, how it's run. They're looking at shared management frameworks for vast tracts of national park, state park, I beg your pardon, and Victorian government land. So the whole idea of a river having an entity like and an identity like the Wimmera River, or what Michael was just talking about where he was working, it doesn't surprise me. I find it intriguing. The only caveat I'd put on it, and it's not one that I feel one way or another about, but that runs straight into questions of common law, law of contract, a very British system of constitutional framework, and how to make those two things meet in a Pacific Rim society that wants to move forward is not as obvious as perhaps the received wisdom of this room suggests.
We have a question and comment from Susanna Klein in the room here. From Klein.
Yes,
Cairo.
thanks. I was really fascinated with the papers, and I have a question about the notion of indigeneity, because we always tend to take it as something that is clear to everyone. And as far as I know, for Hokkaido, the notion of indigeneity is extremely controversial, because it's of course used to various political ends, but first of all, people have been intermarrying more and more. Those people who are extremely politically motivated to make something of the identity have been leaving Hokkaido and have made the decision to fight for their causes somewhere else. And also, there has been this new museum in Hokkaido, which has been criticized a lot as freezing the cultural identity, showcasing something that is kind of very much alluding to the past. So I'm just interested in what you make of this issue of boundedness that keeps hovering during our discussions, and how we can actually deal with this kind of changing negotiation of indigenous identity in tourism development.
I don't feel comfortable speaking about Indigenous identity. I'm not Indigenous. I'm very conscious that I'm a Irish Australian male, born in 1972. And I don't share a watermark with First Australians in that respect. But I would say that there is a formal definition within Australian Indigenous community that identifies you as Aboriginal and enables you to identify as Aboriginal. And it's not just a racial thing, it's also a cultural thing, and it's an engagement with your community in a cultural sense as well. So you can't just join the tribe, but the tribe has to recognise you.
I think if I can add here, perhaps in Japan as well, but in an Australian context, there's historical precedent that has disrupted this kind of issues of identity. In Australia, we have the stolen generation where children were removed, and then how do they reclaim their Aboriginality to some degree? And in Australia,
we have a number of stolen generation, but British child migrants as well.
Yes, of course, yeah. It's uncomfortable for us in Australia, not being Indigenous, to talk about Indigenous people, because of course Indigenous people are not a homogenous group as such. There are many languages and many tribes as well. So I don't, Anne or Michael, do you know?
Yeah, Keir Reeves is completely right. That it's not so easy for us to discuss this point, really. What I think is, or what is important to mention here, it's used very much as a self-definition by Indigenous people. So it's not externally ascribed to them, I would say. It's very much used by themselves, and the way it is used is they want to use it. That's my perception in that way. And yes, there is, of course, with all these sort of identities. I mean, they're always self and other, right? There is that, it comes with it. But yeah, it is something which Indigenous people in Australia do use for different reasons, amongst them for political reasons, but definitely not only.
Thank you.
Something for us to work towards, Susanna. Okay, there's a question that comes from Rod Caldecott. Rod, I'm not sure where Rod is. I think he might be in Asia somewhere. Thank you, Rod, for your question. Thailand.
Yeah.
Someone said yes, Thailand. The talk, Rod says, the talks today really emphasized for me how distance and isolation continue to steer community resilience in Australian rural tourism. As community or private enterprise reach out to tourism, is there sufficient public infrastructure to support them?
You go in. Here's the Tasmanian.
Is there significant public? I think there's been a huge amount of infrastructural support in Tasmania, in terms of supporting businesses. Whether the businesses feel that the huge amount is actually directed in the right direction is another issue. So there's been a lot of money that's been put into, assisting the industry, but it's been directed in certain directions. So it's a kind of yes and no answer, I guess, at the same time. And I think that, the government, the infrastructural support has come at certain times, and then the landscape has changed. So, it came down in the case of Tasmania, and it was directed towards agritourism. But since then, the time has gone on, and the support was about getting people ready for, the arrival of the international tourists, and it hasn't happened. And the international tourist market has basically collapsed because another thing has fallen through, and that is visas. So you might have all this support that has been put towards upskilling the industry and getting them ready for when the borders open. The borders have opened, but another part of public infrastructure, such as the visa system, has completely collapsed. So it's a kind of yes, there is a lot of support, but not necessarily always seem to be directed in the right direction at the right time.
Yeah, I'd just like to put that explicitly in the rural context, Rod, that you asked the question, and come to resilience in a moment. And I would say that it's quite uneven. Say if you fit into the former Victoria jigsaw tourism policy and you're a destination, and Tourism Australia picked up on what you're doing in somewhere like the Yarra Valley, then you're away as a regional destination, and maybe like the Tamar Valley that Anne spoke of. But if you're at the periphery, or you're doing something more nuanced, or it's not as sort of core to the government strategies, and which may be great or may not be, then it might be harder to say that you're getting the infrastructure support, or even as it exists. But I guess the positive thing I'm seeing from a resilience narrative coming out of recent natural disasters, particularly fire and flood, not so much COVID, I think Anne dealt with COVID quite eloquently a moment ago, is that there are significant funds from government who are going to pump prime, not just tourism, but a number of industries as part of a renewal strategy. So there, I can see more infrastructure coming online for the tourism industry in Australia as a result of that. But at the moment, I think it's a bit of a curateau. It's very uneven whether it's heavily resourced or not at all, depending on where you are.
I add just one sentence. I think it's when it comes to rural development or regional development, not just looking at tourism, but more in general, I think there needs to be political support for it. And there needs to be a purposeful political decision to support rural areas. This will not be an automatic process that the economy sort of solves on itself. That or maybe someone can show me an example where that happened. But if there is a will to support regional areas and rural areas, there needs to be, I think, political backing behind it. That's at least my observation.
That's an important point Michael raised, and perhaps those in Japan might understand that, the political imperative for rural development, because political systems and tourism as part of the political system is set up in such a way that in Australia, sometimes the narrative is that the rural areas, policies are made for the rural areas in order for political reasons, for parties to stay in. And I read the same thing in Japan as well, to some degree, how many resources are poured into rural areas in order to gain.
Constant for a nation, Joseph. The bush is going to kind of have to have an agenda.
Yeah. Yanushka, AG, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. And I have a quick question for Anne.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in your research GPS data. And actually, I plan to examine tourist behavior, particular travel patterns among sports tourists before and after watching a mega sports event. And I was going to use GPS data having support from the cell phone company. And I'm not going to use the apps. Actually, I'm going to collaborate with the company who collect the GPS data from our smartphone.
Great.
And I'm just curious if you have found some like significant travel patterns across maybe gender, age, or like other social demographic factors.
In terms of behavior, how people behave,
the travel pattern.
we looked at dispersal and how people move, and there was a paper that we wrote on that specifically, and we found that the factors that influence dispersal were more around whether they had been to the place before, where they entered the place, and also things like transport and weather sometimes comes into it as well. Not so much things like age, gender, or income. In fact, they've been so insignificant in every aspect of the data we looked at. I'm often tempted not to include it at all anymore, because I think they don't show anything. So yes, we did find it. In the past, in other contexts, we've also found that things like your motivation, your country of origin sometimes will affect the amount of days that you travel for and the stops that you take. So yes, we did find differences, but they weren't so much around traditional demographics, rather more around psychographics and, you know, your experience as a traveller, your confidence as a traveller, and also where you actually entered the country and exited the country. But yeah, I'm happy to talk further with you about that. Yeah.
I'm going to take a look at your paper first.
Yeah, sure.
Just on that issue you raised, AJ, there's a question from Monina at the University of the Philippines who asks Anne a question. How do you address data privacy issues when tracking tourists? And do tourists need to agree that they are being tracked?
Yes, so the irony is with our study is with Tracer is that Tracer is all with ethics. So we have to tell people we're tracking them when we ask them to put the app on the phone. And so it's all ethical research. But actually the Google Play Store and the iOS Store, they are the ones that approve your app, and they no longer like apps that are ethical. So if we put when we ask them for permission to put our app on the App Store or the Play Store, we have to say, this is a research app, we ask for ethics, and they don't like it. So it's actually getting harder and harder for us to track with apps. Yet at the same time, those companies, Android and Apple, are collecting more and more of our own personal data. So the irony is it's getting harder for researchers when you do it right and ethically, but it's getting easier for companies to collect data unethically. Yes, so it's getting harder and harder for us. Yeah, but that's the great irony. So you can buy data now that shows movement, but I would argue, according to the Australian National Ethics Statement, that all of that data is collected unethically. Yet the way that we do it, when it's explicit, it's regarded as ethical, but the App Store and Play Store, they don't like it.
So what you're saying is that academics are held to a higher standard of ethical behavior.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Okay. I think we have, before we finish up, we have one more question. Do we still have a question from you, Yanushka, or you?
We have also a question about the methodology, but I can ask that later.
Okay, thank you. Okay, With that said, I think we do things efficiently here at Wakayama University. It's 1 minute to 4 and we were supposed to finish at 4. So we thank you all online for joining us. I think you deserve a clap. We thank all our speakers. We thank all of the important contributions made, questions and presentations. And we also thank Maki Kobayashi, who's here on the screen. She has kept us in order. We have, Tamara Young is here. Tamara Young, do you want to make some final concluding comments? No, Tamara says she doesn't want. Okay, Tamara doesn't want to make any final comments. Thank you.
Maybe she will.
Presentation. Gift.
Oh, go ahead. Also, just to remind everyone, the recorded presentations as well as the PDFs of the PowerPoint presentations will also be made available once we set them up on the website. But Professor Keir Reeves wants to make an impromptu presentation that wasn't part of the plan, and he's taking us over our 4 p.m. timeline.
Sorry.
Microphone?
No, it's okay. Thank you, my friend.
All right, so from us here at the Centre for Tourism Research at Wakayama University, Keir, Anne, and Michael, thank you. Carolyn, AG, and Susanna, thank you as well. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you next time for our next symposium.
Thank you, Joseph.